Good afternoon, everyone. This is a continuation of my very brief clips on certain key issues in philosophical counseling and integrative psychotherapy. And I thought today I might say something about the very concept of an integrative system, which defines integrative psychotherapy. Namely, there are two defining elements of authentic integrative psychotherapy, and they include the use of an integrated perspective, which we call the integrative system, in understanding our psychic experiences and our mental life as a whole, and the use of modal logic as opposed to the classical syllogistic logic, which is emphasized by classical traditional psychotherapeutic schools. Now, the use of modal logic is something a little bit more complicated, and I will deal with that in a separate clip. And today I just want to talk very briefly about the integrative systems, the meaning of that concept, and its use in psychotherapy and in life in general. The starting point of integrative psychotherapy is that the way we experience reality is determined not only by the content of what we experience, but also by the meaning which we attach to that experience. And that meaning derives not only from our past experiences, from our formation as a person, but also from our philosophy of life, namely from an integrative system of meaning which we convey onto our very perception of reality. This is a fairly radical proposition. It's a proposition that it is impossible to understand the world except through a perspective of integrated normative beliefs, except through a perspective of ethics. So we can't understand the world without adopting a philosophy of life which allows us to attach meanings to particular experiences. Now, in practice, this means that, for example, after the pandemic of the coronavirus, if it's over, it's now May 2022, and we still don't know if it's over, but presumably it's over. During the pandemic, we've experienced a surge in depressions and anxiety symptomatology, which supposedly had arisen because of the conditions of confinement, curfew, and general isolation which had been inflicted on the world by the pandemic and by the measures to respond to the pandemic. Now, recovering from that, we find ourselves in social situations in a variety of countries across the world where we are now suddenly more estranged from other people than we used to be before the pandemic. And we can interpret that experience in various ways, but our responses to the experience will depend on our philosophy of life. If we understand life as a competitive process where the meaning and the value of our relationships with other human beings is primarily exhausted in the ability of other people to help us achieve our goals, we will have one type of response to the estrangement. We will feel deprived, we will feel frustrated, we will find it more difficult to advance in our careers, in our social ambitions, etc., because the others who are supposed to be there as primarily as tools, as collaborators, the supposedly willing collaborators to help us achieve our goals, will be less present because of the estrangement. On the other hand, if we perceive ourselves as beings of love, beings who cannot thrive without being loved by others and without loving others, the consequences of the estrangement will be primarily emotional and will concern our well-being. And we see that in many people who come for counseling. If we perceive the world and have a philosophy of life which is one of resilience and ability to withstand difficulty and adversity, then we may we may be best off of all the three mentioned scenarios because we might find the current situation of estrangement to be a challenge which will bring out our hidden capacities to be resilient and to respond to all kinds of adversity in our everyday social interactions. The more important thing with the philosophy of life and the integrative system is that by switching between the integrative systems, by changing our philosophy of life, by changing our experiences, and thus the lens, the ethical lens, the conceptual lens through which we can only experience reality, we can access different perspectives which may allow us to address our problems differently. For example, of all the three sample scenarios which I just mentioned, if someone has a general philosophy of life which is based on cultivating a particular sensibility and affording love a very high place in one's hierarchy of values, and one finds oneself in adverse circumstances where such a philosophy of life does not really help one, one might actually, through philosophical counseling, come to change one's philosophy of life, one's views, and one's thought process, and thus also one's feelings with regard to the fixed outside circumstances, and one might actually access the internal resources to change the context, to change the environment, to change the integrative system. So integrative systems operate on the internal and on the external level. On the internal level, the integrative system is our philosophy of life, our Weltanschauung, as the German philosophers, the classic German philosophers used to call it. And the change of philosophy of life internally, to a large extent, determines our life experience. But we also have external integrative systems, and these are contexts, the value context, which induce values and beliefs in our internal reality, in our mental apparatus, in our psyche. And this is basically the society that we live in. By changing either the internal integrative system, and that is our concepts and philosophy of life, and this requires a process, a critical process of counseling, or possibly and the external integrative system, and that is our society, we can achieve immense results in altering the entire chemistry of our brain, the entire chemistry of our emotional experiences, and thus we may dramatically change our quality of life. So this is why philosophical counseling and integrative psychotherapy are largely synonymous. This is why integrative psychotherapy is so effective in generating long-term results, because it's a conceptual and logical discussion which is in fact a psychotherapeutic intervention, but not a superficial and piecemeal intervention to address certain difficulties in the way we experience reality. It is rather a comprehensive intervention which sort of repacks, resets our internal values and norms and propositions which found our belief systems, and thus allows us to sort of reconstitute our own view of life, our own Weltanschauung, in a way which makes us really unstoppable.